Journal of a Moving Picture. The Trapper. Listened to a few memories of a deranged miner named Evan on the phonograph. In a nearby pile of discarded stories, I even found comic books inspired by the very same memories. It seems to me that these comics were created by artists and authors in other worlds who somehow dreamed of this maniac and his crimes. True in one world, fiction in another, and I suppose vice versa. Makes me wonder if someone in another world is dreaming and writing about us. 12 to midnight. The Crows. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, serpentine dirt road in the middle of nowhere. The derelict house at the end of the road had a roof that sagged and a warped, wide-covered deck with bird feeders that hadn't been filled in years. The vast cornfields surrounding the farmhouse were wild and rumpled. A chime, dangling from a nearby gnarled tree, rang softly in the warm, humid wind as Max Holt, sitting on a hill at a distance, used binoculars to examine the barns, the rusting tractors, and an old, collapsing outhouse. Just beyond the farm, he noticed a cemetery with gravestones etched black against the dusk. He sighed, lowered the binoculars, and wiped beads of sweat off his brow. "So why exactly am I in Texas?" he asked, adjusting a small device in his ear. "What's so special about this abandoned farm?" "It's not abandoned. We decoded a name 2 days ago and tracked him here." Hattie's voice emerged through the tiny black communication device in his ear. "What do we know about the mark?" "Tom Smith, born Nevada, worked as a creative manager in the 60s and 70s in South America for several multinational corporations. No citations, no tickets, no fines. Always paid his taxes on time. Perfect record." Sounds like a cover. "Good observation. His real name is Louis Rand, born in Oakland. Film degree from UCLA. Recruited by the government for a special department. Louis ended up in charge of manufacturing rebellion, meaning he produced fictional radio broadcasts in several countries reporting on the victories of rebels that never existed." Why go through all that trouble? People don't act if they've lost hope. What year are we talking about? 1950s. Louis created fictional rebel groups to revolt against a government that was trying to do some good for its people. Each broadcast reported a growing rebellion marching on the Capitol to depose of the president. Usual fare: lies, terror, propaganda. Fabrications designed to make the rebels seem unbeatable so no one would dare oppose them. The agency created a boogeyman that never existed, and they used that boogeyman to overthrow an elected president trying to do some good for his country. "Right," Max said, "and heard they're working on a sequel to the original War of the Worlds. Looking forward to that myself. Heard it's an epic Five Eyes co-production with no expenses spared." He chuckled as he scanned the vast empty fields behind the farm. "Should I be looking out for mutilated cows or scorched geometric shapes in cornfields?" "Not funny, Max. These operations corrupted, destabilized, and destroyed entire countries. And Louis has information the Veil wants. You need to get to him before they do." Suddenly, Max heard a rumbling in the distance. His binoculars swiveled to a black SUV thundering down the dirt road, throwing great clouds of dust in the air. "Shit, we might be too late. I've got an SUV approaching fast." He hooked his binoculars to his belt and withdrew his pistol. "I'm heading in. Watch yourself." Always. Max rushed down the hill as the SUV came to a stop and 3 shadowy figures vaulted out. 2 agents kicked the front door and charged into the house, while the others stood guard outside. As Max approached the entrance, he lowered to a stealthy crab walk. From inside, he suddenly heard someone cry out in pain. They had Louis and were preparing to torture him. He had to move fast. With a great sense of urgency, Max inched closer to the guard, concealing himself in the shadows. Then, all at once, he sprung up behind him, took him in a chokehold and squeezed until his torso shook and his legs sagged. Carefully, Max lowered the unconscious agent to the ground as Louis released another scream. They had begun to interrogate him. He didn't have much time. Max followed the edge of the house to an open window and climbed inside the cluttered home, and nearly slipped on a counter covered in grime and dead flies. Stacks of dirty dishes covered the kitchen table. Piles of magazines and books rose from the floor to the ceiling. On the walls were black and white surveillance photos of artists painting murals and protesting various dictators that had been selected and sponsored by the agency. Max picked his way into the hallway, moving slowly toward the sound of hard knuckles hitting swollen flesh, accompanied by the occasional groan. He froze suddenly when everything stopped and one of the agents spoke. "Where are the letters? Where are the crows? Who else knows about them?" Louis didn't answer. The punches and groans continued, and so did Max. He inched slowly toward the living room, picking his way around the stacks of boxes and crates, stopping with each step to listen. "Where are the letters?" Louis coughed and struggled with every word. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just an old man who hoards a lot of useless junk from around the world." Max reached the living room and peeked through the open doorway. One agent prepared a small bottle of orange serum and held it up to Louis. "I'll ask my questions again. Disappoint me, you get a drop of grime. Disappoint me again, and we move to a spoonful. Another time, and it's the bottle. If we're mistaken, and you're just an old man who likes to hoard junk from around the world, then you have no idea what grime will do to you." The agent tilted the bottle and let a drop form on the rim and asked, "Where are the letters? Where are the crows? Who else knows about them?" Louis shook his head. "You're dealing with forces you couldn't possibly understand." The agent smiled and let a drop of grime fall into Louis's busted mouth. Louis struggled to keep his mouth closed, but the drop dissolved into his cuts and swollen lips. "I'm told a drop of grime unlocks a doorway to hell," the agent said. "I can't imagine what a bottle would do. Let's try again, and let's not presume to know what I would and wouldn't understand." Louis scoffed. "You remind me of myself when I was first at the agency. Do you even know who you're working for? Who you're really working for? Not the government, not even the corporations. That's what I thought at first, when I realized we weren't working for the government. I thought we were working for the corporations, but they're just tools, like the agency, for a very dark end." "Where are the letters?" The agent filled a spoon with serum and thrust it into his mouth, breaking his 4 front teeth. Louis gagged and coughed and spat blood and saliva. After a long moment, he said, "You know, the serum you hold is made from a very peculiar flower that comes from another place. And I don't mean another country. Where are the crows? Your true masters are into some crazy shit. They are. They don't just sacrifice people to their ancient god. Oh, that'd be too easy. They go a step beyond. They sacrifice villages, towns, and countries, turning them into places of fear. It's all about the fear, hate, anger. Lewis nodded. What we did in the 50s and 70s was just the beginning. They want to sacrifice the world. They do. They think by turning this world into a living hell, they'll bring forth transcendence. The agent sighed. You are a stubborn old mule, aren't you? He grabbed his hair, tilted his head back, and smashed the bottle into his mouth just as Max sprung from the shadows in one fluid motion, firing 2 rounds into each surprised face. Then he rushed to Lewis and pulled the bottle out of his gaping mouth. Lewis smiled at Max. I ain't getting out of this one. I can already hear the voices. The horror. Lewis, stay with me. Lewis stared at Max for a long moment. Then he said, You're the ones they're after. The wrench in their finely oiled killing machine. Max nodded as the comms in his ears sounded. Ask him about what they wanted. He inched closer to Lewis. What do you have that scares them so much? Lewis smiled. Words. Words? Poetry, art, letters. Lewis began to sob, and Max was sure the serum was beginning to act on his faculties. Then he continued. I thought I was a patriot, preventing threats to our way of life. Imagine my surprise when I found out the agency is just a tool for a bunch of rich assholes in dark robes. I hurt so many people. They're coming for me. What did they want? Lewis struggled against the poison coursing through his veins. We targeted her because she was connected. She could see things in the other world. She could see their faces, and she could paint them in a way no remote viewer ever could. When we tried to own her voice, her art, so she wouldn't expose us, she still painted whatever she wanted. Lewis fell silent, and his face tightened. Her mother was the same, and we intercepted her letters to her daughter. We couldn't let her know her mother was still alive. Both mother and daughter had something between them we couldn't possibly understand. A variable we had somehow overlooked. Lewis groaned and trembled and struggled to calm himself before he continued. We paid her father to keep a close eye on her and report anything unusual in her art. She could see crows from the other world. She told her father they were following her, protecting her, and he thought she was crazy. Lewis began to breathe heavily. It was all there, in her collection. The crows, a blueprint of how they planned to sacrifice the entire world to their ancient god. I've seen the paintings, and I still don't get it.
I hate what we did to that poor girl and her brother. At least the mother got away."
Lewis trailed away. He collected his thoughts and took in a deep breath.
"The girl nearly got away, too. She ran, and she started a collective of artists, a rebellion we didn't control, and they painted and wrote poetry against the corruption, against the darkness."
Lewis shook his head, almost in disbelief.
"They published a book of poetry, along with an underground magazine. We had to find every single one of those books and periodicals and burn them."
Lewis began to stammer.
"Her mistake was going to her father. For all the things she had seen, she did not see him."
Lewis lost himself for a moment. Tears formed in his eyes and slowly slipped down his face as he continued.
"She was just an experiment, and she ended up turning against us. She was the key, the leader, the inspiration for them, and for me."
His eyes widened, as though he saw something horrible behind Max. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he continued with difficulty.
"What we did to them, I will never forgive myself for."
Do you have the letters?
"They're coming for me. I can hear them."
Do you have the paintings? Lewis started, then nodded as he struggled for every breath. Max realized he didn't have much time. "Are they in the house?" he asked, leaning closer to Lewis. But Lewis didn't answer. He tried to speak with difficulty, whispering,
15, 13.
He repeated the numbers again, then suddenly shrieked and thrashed in the chair. Max tried to rip the tape off his arms as he jerked about, making the chair thump against the creaking floors. When Max finally freed him, Lewis jackknifed to his feet, charged past him, and dove straight through the window. Bleeding from multiple lacerations, he crawled towards the cemetery before his mouth froze in a hideous scream of terror. Outside, in the growing darkness, Max knelt beside Lewis, checking for a pulse, but didn't find any. Lewis's eyes were wide, and his hand extended out towards the cemetery. "Nothing you could have done for him," Hattie's voice sounded in his ears. Max stared at the dead man's hands, then the cemetery, where he saw gravestones in the moonlight. 15, 13. It could be a safety deposit box, Hattie observed. Max nodded. Yeah, it could be. He narrowed his eyes on the cemetery. The trail of blood Lewis left in the ground was like an arrow pointing to a gravestone. Hold on, I got a hunch. Max stood and proceeded toward the cemetery. You need to be careful. There could be more agents on their way. Government agents I can handle. It's the other shit I'm worried about. Max found a burial plot marked 1513 in the small cemetery, and using a shovel he'd found in a barn, he dug deep into the ground until he hit a coffin. He jumped down into the hole and brushed the dirt off the lid with his blistered hands. Then he heaved the rotten lid open to find a thick lining of black plastic. As he ripped the plastic apart, the scent of wet earth, paint, and burnt wood hit him like a slap in the face. But within moments, he found himself staring at sketches, books, envelopes, statuettes, and paintings from different times and origins. Jackpot, he said, and activated his cell phone camera to send a live stream to Hattie, who was sitting safely in the back of a cramped bookstore in New York City. Mora, Hattie said, as she observed the paintings. We've sensed she was marked like the others, but could never prove it. She was clearly connected. Her voice trailed away pensively as he held the cell phone above a painting of a medieval lord surrounded by stacks of bodies in a crumbling castle. Looks like another artist, also seen into the other realm. Max scanned the paintings, then moved on to a copy of a book titled Poets Against the Darkness. From within the book, he pulled out an envelope with WSFM written on it. What does WSFM stand for? Weird Science and Freaking Magic Department. Max chuckled. What? True story. You're starting to lag. Max looked up, and to his horror, he noticed a thick, unnatural fog creeping over the open grave. Shit, he said with dawning realization. I think I'm in a bleed. I think that's why Lewis hid the artifacts here. But Hattie didn't respond. A high-pitched whine sounded in Max's ear as he instantly pulled off the earpiece. As he thrust his comms into his pocket, he saw crows circling above, and he felt his entire body suddenly prickle with needles. His body was reacting to another vibration as he shifted in and out of another dimension. As he tried to gather himself, he heard a twig snap above. He looked up to see a tall woman made of darkness standing by the grave. Max quickly hid inside the coffin, pulling the wooden lid over. He stared through a crack in the wood at the dark apparition looming above him. It stared down at the coffin with cold, black eyes and black blood-like ink dripping down from its fingers. A crow flew down into the grave, landing on the coffin, pecking nervously at the lid, giving away his position. Max closed his eyes and waited to be dragged away to this other world. But the crow disappeared, and the apparition drifted away from the grave. Max quietly slipped out of the coffin and climbed out of the grave, ascending into a world of fog. He could hear the crows circling above, but couldn't see them. As he ran, he heard the sound of his heart thumping against his chest, and then he heard footsteps behind him, growing faster, louder. Max glanced over his shoulder, but saw only a mass of fog. He didn't wait for whatever lurked in the darkness to snatch him. He charged through the cemetery, jumped over the fence, and stumbled miserably to the ground. Then he closed his eyes and lost consciousness as a high-pitched whine filled his ear. When at last he opened his eyes, it was morning, and beams of golden sunlight poured through the cracks of a door, illuminating the darkness and warming his face. He had no recollection of what had transpired, only vague flashbacks of dragging himself over the ground while unnatural and incomprehensible things moved around him. He remembered the crows, the woman with the black eyes, and the shrieks and screams that rent the night. He remembered seeing the outhouse and crawling through a layer of fog. He remembered opening the creaking red door and hiding inside. Everything else was a blur. Covered in dirt and filth, he stepped out into the harsh white sunlight. He grabbed his phone and called Hattie. A moment later, her face appeared on the small screen. "Thought we lost you there." "I feel like I've been run over by a truck, but I'm still here." Max turned round and round, staring at the old farm. "I don't remember much." "You were out the whole night." "Yeah, well, it felt like an eternity."
Chamber of Blood. The Red Crane. Snake in the Garden. Saku spent the day piling the decomposing bodies she had discovered in the remote mountain village. Mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, children. All killed in a ritualistic manner. And as night descended, she set the victims of the Black Serpent Society ablaze. The flames rose violently and shot burning red embers into the black abyss above. As the fire waved and crackled, Saku watched the flames devour flesh and tried not to think of the suffering the society had put the village through. One of their members was becoming, and the becoming ceremony was a rite of passage. The member would drink tea brewed from the purple petals of a flower they harvested from another world. And this tea either killed them or brought them a nightmare from this other world that they would have to recreate in this one. She had witnessed 3 of these nightmares before. Horrifying monuments made out of villagers who had been hunted down like game and tortured and restructured into a human offering. She didn't know what horrors these snakes had seen in the other world, but whatever they had seen could not have been more horrific and brutal than what they created in this world. Reflecting on the offerings Saku had seen in the past, she expected she would find a similar offering not too far from the village. And so, preparing for the worst, she grabbed a branch on the ground and lit a torch from the burning pyre. Carefully, she made her way into the surrounding woods. It wasn't long before Saku found a pile of clothing and a trail of gore and petals. She followed the trail to a mound of beautiful flowers growing from the hacked bodies of villagers. With a sigh, she examined the area, the flickering torchlight lighting the way. Within moments, she realized the area had been hacked and cleared so that it resembled a kind of maze. The villagers had been hunted and captured in this maze that was meant to resemble a snake's nightmare. That's what she called members of the society. Snakes. There was nothing human about them. People had warmth and empathy, and these cultists lacked both, and likely had cold blood running through their veins. And Saku knew the creator of this maze and offering might still be around, embedded in its offering to the Black Serpent, symbolically shedding its human skin. Saku turned back to the offering and held her breath as she searched the ghastly faces of the dead for signs of life. As she searched for the snake in this garden of death, she suddenly heard the crackle of undergrowth behind her. Instinctively, Saku ducked as a thick axe whirred over her head and cut through flowers and a bloated torso. Stepping back, she dropped the torch and turned to face a snake in a demon mask shrieking at her. The snake withdrew the axe and attacked wildly. With short, quick steps, Saku evaded savage blows. Then she withdrew her gleaming sword, and in one fluid motion, she decapitated the snake and watched the headless torso stagger left and right, as a fountain of warm blood sprayed the ground and trees. The torso collapsed and became one with the offering as the head rolled away and finally stopped at the base of a tree. Saku walked over to the head, picked it up, and removed the mask to reveal a young woman with wide, unblinking eyes. Feeling sad for this woman who had been charmed, groomed, and corrupted by the society, she carried the head to the offering where she placed it next to the torso. Gently, Saku picked up the flickering torch from the ground and set the offering on fire. The burning stack of bodies reflected bright orange in her eyes as she remembered her clan and wondered if she would ever stop the society from corrupting and destroying her beloved country.
Dawn of the Flesh Eaters, 1. "Where are you taking me?" Laurie asked as she followed Ian through the woods. "Point Pleasant Peak." Ian stepped towards a chain-link fence, searching for the hole he had created a week ago, sidestepping a pile of bones and gore that had once been a coyote. "We shouldn't be here. We should turn back." "Nonsense," Ian said, finding the hole in the fence. "It's going to be just like old times." Except that it wasn't. Today would be better than old times. Today would be a special day. A day like none other. A day that would rise above all other days. Ian had been planning the hike to their special place for a little over a year, and nothing would get in his way. Not the fence, not the law, not even the creepy Genetic Research Institute that had bought up all the land. You know, they closed the trail for a reason. They closed the trail because some corrupt mayor sold public land to a corporation. Should have never happened in the first place. Ian yanked at the edge of the hole in the fence. Let's get to the peak and snap some pictures. Lori smiled at him, then crouched and pushed her way through the hole, saying, "What's the worst thing that can happen?" Dawn of the Flesh Eaters 2. A deep orange glow penetrated the canopy as Ian and Lori followed an old trail up to Point Pleasant Peak. The air was fresh and cool, and every now and then Lori stopped to snap a picture of a plant or flower or bird, while Ian checked his pocket for the little black box that contained all the hopes and dreams he had for their collective lives. He was going to do it. He was really going to do it. Lori stopped suddenly and pointed at two hawks circling in the distance. Ian stepped up to her, observing, and she snapped pictures. An omen, he thought. A beautiful, majestic couple working together in complete harmony. They circled together in the amber sky, one clockwise, the other counterclockwise. Their graceful paths twined and intersected with wings fully spread as they searched for dinner. Then they stopped circling and swept down with wings half bent, disappearing into the woods. Lori trained her camera at the trees, waiting for the hawks to re-emerge with dinner. But when no hawks burst from the trees after a few minutes, they continued up the trail, reminiscing about the first time they had met on the trail. He had seen her feeding squirrels to draw them closer for a picture. He remembered telling her it was bad luck to feed wildlife. She told him to mind his business, that she made her own luck. They had been together ever since. Dawn of the Flesh Eaters 3. Ian didn't understand why Lori suddenly froze as she clambered up the trail. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping up beside her. Lori shook her head slowly. "I feel like we're being watched." "You're letting your imagination get the better of you. Come on, let's go." A soft chirping sound began from every direction. "I don't recognize that sound." "Just birds." "Well, that's not coming from birds." The sound suddenly faded into silence. Ian nudged her and smiled and gestured for her to continue up the trail. She did, but within moments they both stopped at the sight of two dead hawks, surrounded by feathers and warm blood. "Looks like they messed with the wrong mouse." Ian swallowed hard, trying to make light of the situation, secretly hoping he'd get another omen along the way. Lori snapped a picture. "Something's not right. What could have done that to a hawk?" Ian didn't answer for a long, pensive moment. Then he forced a laugh, grabbed her hand, and led her up the trail to their special place. Dawn of the Flesh Eaters 4. The forest was strangely quiet when Ian and Lori came upon a cottontail in the middle of the trail. They stood before the bunny for a moment, staring into its small black eyes. Ian was pretty sure a rabbit was a good omen and was a sign that the day would turn out exactly as he had planned. 7 years good luck if you feed a helpless bunny." Lori laughed and searched her rucksack for a carrot. "Don't," Come on. The poor chub looks like it hasn't eaten in days. Ian sighed. I guess one carrot isn't the end of the world. Laurie prepared her camera as she extended the carrot to the rabbit. As she did, the strange chirping sound returned, rising louder and louder all around them. A cold tingle suddenly ran down Ian's spine. Something about the critter's eyes told him they had made a grave error in judgment, and that the day wouldn't be as perfect as he had imagined it would be. Laurie inched back from the seemingly helpless rabbit, then stumbled on her haunches as it suddenly roared with a mouth filled with needle-like teeth. The roar was a call, and soon hundreds of flesh-eating rabbits sprang out of the shadows and surrounded them. Ian didn't process much after that. He fell back and hit his head on a boulder as millions of needles punctured his skin and ripped away flesh, muscle, and bone. He heard Laurie scream, and for a moment he wished he hadn't been such a damn romantic. Then black fog filled his vision as he yelled out a question, and his stubborn hand fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small black box.
Year 7, Day 207, Morning. Since we've arrived at the tower, James has spent most of his time going through the stories and journals left by the previous occupants. He keeps a journal of his own and is determined to write a movie about our collective experience. The other day, I looked over his shoulder to see what he was writing in his notebook. To my surprise, he had transcribed an entire conversation between the parks. I cleared my throat to secure his attention. He turned around, startled, staring at me with what I could only describe as a homicidal glare. It was as though I had interrupted the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I questioned the etiquette and morality of eavesdropping. He questioned the etiquette and morality of reading over his shoulder. He then added that anything and everything is fair game for a writer. Year 7, Day 207, Afternoon. I went up to my favorite spot on the roof of the tower, where I listened to memories recorded on vinyl records by one of the previous occupants, whose disappearance still remains a mystery. The air smelt of ammonia and wet leaves. The fog tossed and heaved and rolled endlessly towards the horizon, as laughter and arguments rose from the 9th floor. Donald, the carpenter, and a few others built a mini-putt out of all the things from other worlds, for our amusement and entertainment. Year 7, Day 207, Night. Life here is an unrelenting struggle against alienation, anxiety, depression, and boredom. The mini-putt helps. The stories, too. We all take turns reading them. James takes it to another level and performs them. Before he was a writer, he was an actor who had worked on several radio serials and advertisements. With all these distractions, it's nice to forget the horrors of this world and the hard fight to maintain our sanity.